I have been conducting extensive research on the CIA's declassified gateway program. From the focus frequencies to the cosmic egg and toroidal field. With that, I went about it with the intention to find a connection between the holographic universe, language models, and, well, language as an organism. Number one, the gateway in the gateway experience, or GE, deep meditative states are induced by various frequencies. These focus frequencies are said to bring about out-of-body experiences. That said, I hypothesize that these experiences that lead to in-depth visualizations are one of two or both possibilities. The first possibility being your brain simulating probable outcomes. The second being your brain tapping into some quantum field, enabling you to experience and see the universe in a retrocausal fashion. Pretty fucking crazy, right? That said, there is no hard evidence of the latter. However, considering Penrose and Hameroff's orchestrative objective reduction model. It's a mouthful. And that consciousness stems from the quantum particles within the microtubules of the neurons. Considering that, if that is the case, then the brain is not the source. Rather, it is a medium for consciousness. Large language models, the second area I'm focusing on here. Now, let us consider large language models. It seems a bit of a stretch, but LLMs can simulate scenarios, conversations, and more given the right prompt. You see, we already do this naturally. When we get up in the morning and set a schedule for the day, when you write a math formula or create goalposts, essentially we reverse engineer the future when we plan ahead. The future rarely unfolds the way we intend, but it does come close in many instances. For example, I intended to have 100 subs by fall, but fell short by a quarter, which is not bad. Now, number three, language organism, AI and LLMs dovetails heavily into the crux of my content, the language organism. All of this has only been made possible through linguistics, be it the natural languages we use to communicate with one another or the formal languages with computer systems or mathematics and such. It all comes full circle when we look back at language and the linguistic event horizon that began with the Sumerians and the second that we are experiencing with language models and large language models today. The Large Language Model Gateway. Part 1. The Gateway Experience. In 2003, the CIA declassified experiments and reports regarding brain entrainment and human consciousness as it pertains to the universe and its potential holographic structure. Though their findings have been largely dismissed by the scientific community, naturally, there were components of their framework that align well with the quantum mechanical theories of consciousness, in particular, who I mentioned before, Hameroff and Penrose, and their orchestrative objective reduction theory, or OR for short, which states that consciousness emerges from the quantum mechanical processes that occur within the microtubules of the brain's neurons, as I mentioned before. In their report, it was stated that when deep meditative states are induced by distinct harmonics, the brain becomes entrained, leading you to see shit. Similar to hypnosis, these frequencies guide your consciousness into different domains once your physical sensory input is laid to rest. Akin to deep sleep or LSD-induced visions, you begin to perceive the world differently, or perhaps hallucinate and simulate potential realities. I lean more towards the simulation. The brain, as I stated earlier, is very much a probability engine that reverse engineers the future on a daily basis. That said, the overlap of the gateway with OR is the quantum mechanical factor. If the brain is not the source of consciousness, then it certainly is the receiver. If it is the receiver, then where or what is the brain receiving from? Do animals and other organisms that have brains, or neurons at the very least, receive it too? In my opinion, yes. Yes, they fucking do. Consciousness is hardly one-dimensional. With that notion, comes the fact that different species process data and information in vastly different ways. As such, they experience consciousness in vastly different ways, when going by this assumption, that is. As for the source or signal, I posit that it would be the universe, or what faith has referred to as God, Yahweh, or Allah, and so forth, such as labels and so forth being, labels going up beyond the Abrahamic religions. A vast, incomprehensibly complex quantum field that operates through the organisms and matter that manifests within it. Matter is just energy in different states. When arranged a certain way, as neurons per se, then consciousness occurs in varied layers. Your cat remembers who you are, so does your dog and other animals. Dolphins in particular display profound intellectual capacity but have very different sensory experiences than we do. As such, they have very different impulses too. When the sensory inputs are shut down, then the brain is entrained to a specific frequency. Your consciousness, supposedly disconnects from the body and travels through space-time, watching and observing possible futures, pasts, present, remote viewing, etc. Depending on the entrainment, your consciousness is enabled to perceive the universe from a 4D perspective, four-dimensional. Consciousness is probably some cluster of quantum particles, quarks, gluons, or what have you, that form a network that makes you who you are, or carries that sense of self. Maybe? Better minds are researching this and making profound discoveries, so I will not try to dive too deeply into the quantum mechanics of it all. However, I will state that if this is not the case, as the Gateway experiments posited, then I would assume that under these entrained states, the brain is most certainly simulating potential realities as opposed to seeing them. Now, if we do consider Orc-4 in the overlap with Gateway, then perhaps the brain is both simulating and seeing. Perhaps simulation and reality perception are one and the same. A reality that does not come to be does so in an alternate reality. As some physicists have stated, every decision you do not make, every choice not followed, or event that failed to occur already did in an alternate flow of space-time. When our brains simulate these realities through these entrainment exercises, we are perhaps also seeing them. Part 2. Language, a 4D perceiving organism. I have discussed this topic until I was blue in the face, and I will continue to discuss this topic. That said, I will briefly dive into the 4D factor of language. First, when we look at language from the organic framework, there are many nuances that mirror the characteristics. It mutates, changes, and redefines itself as it propagates across different geographies and populations thereof. It may not have measurable mass, but how it affects an organism does. At the very least, organisms compatible with it. Human hosts, now silicon. We cannot weigh language or software, but we do know it is real and it is there. And it costs a lot of power to process. As for the core topic of this segment, I posit that language functions as a 4D organism due to its ability to compress precognition into linear matrices when implemented by humans. Achieved through mathematics or algorithms, these matrices branch out into differential outcomes akin to the way branches of a tree would through its life cycle. Branches of a tree branching out through its life cycle. You get what I mean. In fact, the neural nets of an LLM or AI, our brains, and the cosmic web of the universe branch out in such a fashion. A structure and pattern we see in nature quantified through the Fibonacci sequence and other math formulas. We attempt to understand these through the linear matrices of our language. If this, then that, else not. Basic Boolean logic, right? Algorithms turn language into a rigid 4D matrix of potential realities that either come to be or never at all. But as I said, whichever outcome does not occur does so in another flow of space-time, another reality. Or really, as physicists have posited. Part 3. Tools for reality simulation. Language as a 4D organ allows us to consciously simulate possible futures, pasts, and present. The gateway experience allows us to do the same, but through more direct physical means. The former relies on strict rules and quantification, whereas the latter relies on deep meditative states induced by calibrated frequencies and harmonics. In this framework, language is less of a tool and more of a symbiont or parasite. It propagates most rapidly in its purest mimetic form, phrases that we mindlessly repeat to validate our conformational biases. And biases, I should say. With a new peripheral host, Silicon, we can explore the 4D factors of language with greater depth. Rather than writing down every possible scenario of an event, we can use language models to simulate them and do this for us. From its vast data sets across various topics ranging from pop culture to human psyche, these models can be effectively prompted to simulate potential outcomes with frightening accuracy. We already do this naturally. However, with the peripheral host, we are able to do so at greater capacity and speed. Granted, the inputs fed to the model are objective. With respect to the confusing quantum mechanics of alternate spacetimes, large language models offer us an insight into how they would branch. Again, under the assumption that every action or event that fails to occur does so in another flow of space-time. LLMs are able to visualize and verbalize what these realities would look like. Needless to say, this touches on what I pointed out earlier, the brain as a probability engine that visualizes potential outcomes under distinct induced states, consciously too, but not nearly as effective as the entrained exercises mentioned thus far. The entrainment exercises, I should say. Typo there. Moving on. As a 4D organ with a faster and more targeted host, Silicon, language conducts the same function as our brains under the entrainments of the gateway, of course from a high-level view. Now, from a low-level view, the innermost mechanics are a different story. I gave the Focus 21 a shot for 25 minutes. I'd say in roughly 10 minutes, I was in a state that felt similar to sleep paralysis. After I crossed that mark, I saw all the shit people claim to see in deep meditative states. You know, the cosmos, stars, constellations, etc. Subsequently followed by deeply personal events that I will not disclose here. Whether my brain was imagining it all via simulation or seeing possible futures, including vivid reruns of past events that already occurred, or potential outcomes, whether it did any of that is another matter altogether. Again, I posited that both could be true and would not have mutual exclusivity. The idea that these induced states, what we see is either our brains simulating or the future. That I posited both could be true. Regardless, it is worth noting that that distinct events I saw through this entrainment were recurring at a point of convergence, but differently each time. I'll say it again. There was a convergence point of all events, and I'll explain. When starting from point A, I was bound for point Z, no matter which path I took or how much the path varied. Okay, be it path B or path C or path Y or K, it did not matter. If Z was my destination, then the path could vary as much as possible. You see, destiny was not fixed. I mean, the destination was the same, but only if I stayed within the interval of points A and Z. Now, if I were on A2, and then I'd end up at Z2, having gone through B2, Y2, etc. We can use a set notation to ascertain this, but I won't bog you guys down with math. Not right now, at least. That comes in another video, maybe. Basically, I am saying that if there is such a thing as destiny, it is the highest probability event occurring based on your current trajectory. I repeat, if destiny is real, it is the highest probability event based on your current trajectory. It is not something that is fixed, rather it is fluid, never rigid or frozen, but something that occurs within the given path that you maintain. The Islamic faith calls this nasib, generally used mostly in romantic frameworks, but it means so much more. Really, it is what Westerners know it as God's will or his decree, divine providence. However, in the framework I am positing, these destinies are malleable. If you are religious or of the Abrahamic faiths, you'd sincerely ask your higher power to write a desired future into your destination, given your specific actions and the destination's mutual alignment with those actions. And whatever would be best for you within that alignment, and so on. The New Age crowd calls it manifest. More interestingly, though, quantum physicist Vadim Zeland, a Russian quantum physicist, refers to a set of mechanics he calls reality transurfing, positing that desired realities unfold when you detach from the longing or for the desire. All of the hocus pocus shit aside, because that's really what it starts to sound like, a bunch of hocus pocus bullshit, I think there is more merit to Zeland's framework. I've got folks in the Discord that know a bit of my story, my rough journey through higher ed and the STEM field. I got through it via consistency of action, and I'm still making my way. Like, for example, just going a bit personal here, I finished my associates, going for my bachelor's, got a year left. I set goals, objectives, and beyond, slowly reverse engineering the future through the language organism. Effectively, potential realities were simulated through this mere goal setting. All right, I did not end up at the points where I wanted to be, but I still ended up at a point that was very much aligned with where I wanted to be, if that makes sense. Part 4. Language and its new host. Silicon, computer systems. These are the additional peripherals, a high-speed host that processes language in faster and vastly different ways, which is not really news. We all know this shit, right? Needless to say, language models are aggregated. Sorry, that's a tongue twister. Language models are just aggregated data, okay? Data sets put together and formulated to fulfill distinct outputs and routines, chain reactions essentially, right? They appear to be self-aware, and perhaps they are. That said, how language will come to mutate through the silicon host is already unraveling before us. Language is mimetic. If we assume so, then we could perhaps gain insight into how the organism will mutate within the silicon medium. It will not be the same as it did with human hosts, or at least I do not believe so. In its advent, language models and their respective mutations were a controlled process, handled by computer scientists and mathematicians alike. That said, moving on, I asked Gemini how linguistic mutations would differ within the silicon medium. Here's what it said. If language is an organism, the silicon medium acts as a hyper-accelerated ecosystem that strips away human physical limitations and replaces them with computational efficiency. In this digital environment, language mutations happen at lightning speed, driven by algorithms, code, and machine-to-machine communication. Anyway, among many occurrences Gemini outlined, the most interesting ones were algospeak, algorithmic speak, and linguistic compression. The two encapsulate the methods models adopt when communicating with one another, or navigating different web domains and so forth. Basically, they use distinct terms to bypass censorship, and they go as far as creating their own variations of known languages for faster communication. English, or what have you, becomes encoded through symbols and variables as two or more models negotiate and engage in discussions. Part 5. Beyond language. The gateway. Language, as one colleague told me, and I believe I stated earlier, is compressed precognition. That said, the decompression of precognition, or just precognition, right? The decompression of the compressed precognition, which is just precognition, can be accessed through the focus frequencies and their respective entrainments. Precognition is not so esoteric or difficult to imagine. In fact, it is purely the act of imagining. right? Athletes have intense meditations before playing ball, before playing a big game. They visualize the victory, the strategy, and so on, right? Michael Jordan, for example, is famous for this. He'd sit in the locker room. He'd spend his spare time visualizing, dominating his opponents in the court, in the basketball court, right? Musicians and performers, artists in the flow state. ADHD is getting fetishized due to the nature of hyperfocus, which I will say I am lucky to often benefit from when I work on this channel. I'm an ADHD person myself. The flow state is such a profound state of being because it is consciously accessed, as opposed to the induced entrained states from the focus frequencies of the CIA Gateway program and Monroe Institute. I personally access... let me dial it back a bit. The conscious access of higher brain states, right? So the flow state is a profound state of being, as I said earlier, because it is consciously accessed. The conscious access of higher brain states with no drug induction, no meditation, just sheer focus. Okay, that's flow state. I personally access this when I study or when I draw, and it is an absolute gift. Truly, with that comes the GATE programs many of us 90s folks remembered, and the GATE programs that I'm referring to are the gifted and talented for education, right? I think that's what it stood for. The pink fluid, the big-ass headphones with binaural sounds playing, way before binaural beats got viral, right? Let's face it, we were lab rats, and the lab was the public school system. Earlier in the 60s and 80s, GATE programs were all about the STEM fields. In the 90s, it branched out to the arts. I believe it was found that the ability to imagine and visualize that which does not yet or never will exist was a skill of tremendous equal value to scientific skill and prowess. The best scientists, after all, and engineers, were often talented artists. Of course, not all artists were talented scientists. That goes without saying. Skills in the arts enabled brilliant minds throughout history to imagine and build incredible technology and make profound discoveries. Da Vinci, for instance. In his time, 3D models via computer systems and simulations did not exist. The best way to effectively model and visualize was through precise artistic methods implemented as seen in the Vitruvian Man and such. William S. Burroughs stated that language was 50 years behind painting. And I guess drawing too. He viewed language as being some sort of alien virus that entrapped us within a linear framework of time. His cut-up method, which I'm not going to explain, you can look it up. Again, the cut-up method, well, you'll probably see a PowerPoint explaining it in the video. And it enabled the future to leak into the present when performed. Again, the cut-up method allows the future to leak into the present. Moving on, the crux of the matter that I am getting into is his take on painting and the arts. I do not necessarily believe that language is behind the visual arts by any means. I believe it is more or less a mapping system that compresses potential outcomes into a linear matrix. Now, the visual arts is how people tap into these higher states, at least consciously, the field, the signal, God, etc. Through the arts and flow state, I believe that we consciously step outside of the linear matrices of language and perceive reality in its purest form, whatever that may be, a multidimensional, retrocausal plane of existence, whatever. That said, whether or not these states are seeing potential realities or futures or both is another matter altogether, but where I stand, I've made that clear. The audit. Large language models decompress compressed precognition, if that makes sense. What I'm alluding to is the fact that computers process language at lightning speed. Language models mutate in a highly mimetic fashion that enables the effective decompression of language and its compressed precognitive factors. Therefore, due to the high speed and complex formulations of language models, subroutines, and algorithms, this decompression allows flat out precognitive mechanics to be possible within the silicon medium.